Good afternoon, welcome, and on behalf of the Institute of Governmental Studies and on behalf of the University of California, Berkeley, I'm really delighted to open this conference, the 2010 Governor's Race, the Inside Story. For 20 years, IGS has organized conferences on each gubernatorial campaign, bringing together campaign officials, political consultants, scholars, journalists, and others to examine the most important elections in the nation's largest state. And these conferences have provided a historical record of these events, which then have been appeared in the form of books edited by IGS. Contrary to what some people apparently believe this year, the purpose of this event is not to rehash, it's not to second guess, it's not to gloat, and it's certainly not to indulge in academic self-congratulation. Rather, this event is really a rare opportunity for all of us, especially, I think, students on campus and faculty around, is to learn from professional practitioners and seasoned observers what this election campaign teaches us about the structure and changing dynamics of electoral politics in California. And that's what we will be able to do over the next 2 days. I want to thank the sponsors of this year's conference who have generously provided the resources to make it possible. First, Darius Anderson and Platinum Advisors, Chevron Corporation. I don't know if Shouty Fulp is here, but thank you, Shouty, for doing this. The California Association of Realtors, and I think Dave Howard is here. Would you maybe acknowledge yourself or wave? Thank you very much. Oh, hi, Shouty. I didn't see you. Okay. Farmers Insurance, Adama Iwu. I don't know if she's here. And then the law firms of Remco, Johansson, and Purcell. Karen Getman was our board member who's with that firm. And then Nielsen, Merksema, Paranello, Gross, and Leone. Individually, Susie and Steve Swat and Colleen McAndrews. Is Colleen here? Hi. Thank you very much, everyone. I want to acknowledge also the presence here of my predecessor as director of IGS, Eugene Lee, who was director for 17, 18 years, and I think who initiated these events and many other things about California. Gene, pleasure to have you here. Of course, a special thanks to Ethan and his staff for making this thing work. Now I'd like to ask Darius Anderson, someone who I think we all know is steeped in knowledge of California politics from years of experience. In addition to being the CEO of Platinum Advisors, Darius is, as Ethan mentioned, the chairman of the National Board of Advisors for IGS. And his personal generosity and his leadership of the board in this period of grave fiscal stress for the university really have been instrumental in making it possible for IGS to continue its leadership in the study of California politics and governance. So Darius, thank you for all you've done. Thanks, and the floor is yours.
That was a glorified way of saying that I do all the fundraising. And as many of you know, the great work that Jack does. When I took over, Bruce Kane, many of you know, invited me to be on the board 5 or 6 years ago. And when Jack came on board and took over the Institute, I took over as chairman. And together, Jack and I have really done 2 amazing things, one of which I'm really proud of, and that is the fact for the first time we brought a bipartisan approach to the board at IGS. And you'll see 2 of those individuals, and I want to thank them. Both Duff Sondheim and Bob Naylor have brought a great balance to the IGS board. Traditionally, we'd always been Democrats, but now for the first time, we took a cardinal, and Duff is serving. I know it's very hard for him being a Stanford alum, But Duff, I want to say personally thank you for all you've done for IGS. Secondly, we have gone ahead for the first time in IGS history and set record amounts on the fundraising front. And for the first time, IGS as a research unit is now raising real serious dollars. This year we raised over $300,000 to go to both an endowment as well as the other activities. So I want to say thank you to Jack and all the staff and the amazing things that they do, to everybody else on the board. And I'm most proud to announce that we have a new scholarship that was committed today. Phil Traunstein has agreed to go ahead and give IGS a new scholarship on behalf of Cal Buzz. So let's give Phil a round of applause. So if we can have the panelists go ahead and come up, and we'll go ahead and start.
Nice to meet you. Nice to see you again.
There we go. All right. I don't know that we need necessarily to do the whole go down the panel because there are these little placards and presumably y'all can read who's who. I'm Mark Barabak of the LA Times. This is Timm Herdt of Ventura Star. We're going to be your moderators today. I was going to take just a minute, being one of those important journalists, to first of all thank those folks who did show up here today. To express just a bit of disappointment that I know a lot of folks share that there was not a formal representative of the Whitman campaign here. Duff Sondheim has very kindly agreed to do this by proxy. And I say this by way also of I wouldn't call it an admonition, but a reminder, which is something that Jack said starting out about the nature of today's discussion and what we hope to accomplish. I have been working lately on a story, hopefully coming soon to a newspaper near you, involving history and the nature of history and historical inquiry, and talked to a lot of folks, someone at Stanford. Duff is an alum. Don't hold it against him here in Berkeley. But David Kennedy and others, and the question I kept coming back to them is, why does any of this matter? Why does history matter? Why do we care what the Constitution said, if the New Deal worked or didn't deal? And the answer I kept getting from folks is, history matters because what we do is very much determined by our understanding and our appreciation of the past, which brings me to today's discussion. What we're trying to create here is an historical record of this campaign, and it's something that's going to be used in textbooks, in classrooms. I don't know that there are any folks out here, but I know several of us have dealt with people in this campaign who not too many years ago were Berkeley students who read this material. So again, I'm sorry the Whitman folks aren't here to flesh out. They're a part of this, but I would just ask those people who are here today to remember this is what we're trying to accomplish. There'll be plenty of time to celebrate your victories or mourn your losses or what have you, but to the extent you can be open and candid, it'll make it that much richer and a more valuable historic record. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague.
All right, well, as long as we're focused on getting the historical record straight, I thought maybe we might start off with finding out what point in time did this campaign for governor 2010 start. And I noted here that I looked in late September of 2006 in a column on the Attorney General's race at that time. George Skelton asked Attorney General candidate Jerry Brown if he was interested in running for governor in 2010, and his answer was, no, I don't want to be governor. I've been there. That's a tough job for a Democrat. They have a very rocky road. Well, by January, clearly that had changed, and I'm wondering if we could just start off by trying to figure out at what point did this campaign for governor begin? Steve?
You talking about the primary campaign?
I'm talking about, well, the primary was the stage one.
We didn't have a primary.
Right, you did. Right, your primary
So
didn't start until March of 2010. Is that right?
That
is
is
that what
correct.
you're telling me?
My answer is very simple, yes.
Well, no, come on. Now, I mean, clearly it was, I'd like for you to speak a little bit about the importance in your mind of having a clear field and being able to not have a primary and what you may have done to help advance that.
Well, first, maybe to go back to, I think, what was your original question, which was, what was Jerry thinking? I think what he said back in 2006, I think, was genuine, that he wasn't really looking ahead. He was looking at the job that he was facing, and that's what he wanted to do at that time. But what did go on in 2009, leading up to 2010, is that he was going through, first, he was doing his job as Attorney General, and he was enjoying it. Secondly, he was trying to get a better understanding of the problems the state was facing, and went through a period of consultation with a whole wide variety of people about, what's going on in the state, is it fixable? A lot of focus on the budget and getting into the weeds on the budget in terms of what's really going on here. He also had a different vantage point at that time as the attorney for the governor, that he was able to kind of see some of the dysfunction, particularly in the area of corrections that he was defending. And so he did go through a period of a lot of reflection about the job of the governor, whether it was something that was right for him and something he thought he could do well in terms of declaring a candidacy. So that was the background.
Well, hang on. Let me, okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to be the resident skeptic, but, and we can argue about this till the cows come home, but I think a lot of us are going to have a hard time believing that Jerry that the thought just never crossed his mind that he might want to run for governor again. That October 2006, I've been there, tough job, rocky road, forget it. And then what? January 2007, he begins telling people that he's going to run, that he's going to win. So we're talking about a window of 2 months or so. I mean, what sort of on that road to Damascus? What was the moment?
I don't know. We're trying to get a budget done in 2 months. That's a long period of time.
I'll actually.
Yeah, well, Peter, yeah, what was your thought? Was it?
I agree with Steve. He didn't have a primary.
Well, look, the facts are to even consider a race, you have to create a campaign committee to even raise a dollar. So even when you go through those preliminary steps of talking to folks about the race, of putting together a committee that can legitimately raise money for a race, those are all preliminary steps. It's not a final decision to do it, but those are things that Gavin certainly went through and other candidates went through, and Jerry did the same.
So if we want to pinpoint, we want to start, is there a moment when he went from no way to thinking about it? Can you pinpoint that date or when it was?
I can't.
Well, Peter, Gavin declared in July of 2008. I mean, at that point, was the thinking that the Attorney General was clearly in the race and he was the candidate to beat?
Well, I think one of the reasons why that at the time Mayor Newsom and now Lieutenant Governor Newsom was thinking about getting into the race is because there was a bit of, it was fluid in terms of who was going to be in it. And we did actually do some polling in the November of 2008. It gave us a sense of what the race would look like. And I'm going to actually give it out to all the journalists here because I know it's what they all want. At the end here. No, I'm just kidding. But you can look at it, I just can't actually let you take it home. But what we saw from that was that Brown was the most formidable candidate in the race. And we tested a variety of scenarios, 4 or 5-way primaries, because at the time there was a potential of Antonio Villaraigosa being in the race. There was a potential of Jackie Speer, who had been talked about, obviously. Brown, Garamendi. And when we looked at it, though, it was clear that Jerry Brown was the strongest candidate. But we didn't know if he was actually going to run. We didn't know how it actually was going to play out. Under the scenario of that kind of with that uncertainty, from our perspective, and my personal experience with Gavin going back to 2004, we had as good a shot as anybody of winning the race. I personally, was with the mayor for the first, I don't remember exactly, but it's 3.5, 4 years of his administration. Then I was worked on his campaign, and since then, up until this day, I've served as an advisor to him. Don't make any money off it, but it's a lot of fun. We just weren't really sure how it was going to play out. As we get a little bit further down the road, I can tell you how it actually did play out.
So turning to the Republican side, we have Steve Poizner, the state insurance commissioner, wins a smashing re-election victory. He had a job to do. I'm sure he was focused on doing just the best job he could as state insurance commissioner. But somewhere in there, maybe like Jerry, the thought came into his head that, gee, maybe I'd like to be governor. Can you give us a bit, because Steve Poizner was the first one to, strike that, Tom Campbell, we'll get to him, but Poizner wins re-election rather handily in 2006, and he begins dreaming dreams of being governor at what point?
Well, first off, he won election in 2006.
One election, sorry.
Original election.
Right. Your microphone.
I think you just have to get closer. So he won election in 2006. Frankly, I don't know when he started thinking of running for governor. I was at the McCain campaign in 2008, and I remember the night of John McCain's speech having an intense conversation about who would be a better candidate, Steve Poizner or Meg Whitman for governor. But my thinking is that he started probably in 2008 thinking about it. And
can I interject? I mean, the presumption being Republicans, with all due respect to our Republican friends, didn't exactly have a terribly deep bench. So being statewide office holder, naturally the talk focused on Poizner as a potential gubernatorial candidate.
Correct.
Well,
okay.
I think, I just remember Steve during the campaign was asked about this a lot, and he said when he, correct me if I'm wrong, but early on, after he had sold his company and got involved in public service, he knew that he wanted to hold an office where he could help California. And I don't know the exact day of when he decided, all right, I'll file the papers to run for governor, but he certainly knew that if he was going to be governor, that he would have to work his way up the chain. And so volunteered at the school, ran for local office, ran for insurance commissioner, and then ultimately ran for governor. There was another candidate in the race that just went right for governor. And I think that was, that's part of what Steve was. He knew that if he wanted that top spot, he had to work his way up the chain. So was it in 2009? Was it in 2010? I mean, I think it was much earlier. I think when he started his political life, he realized if he wanted to help California, he had to be governor.
And I want to, just to go back and correct, I mentioned Duff very kindly sitting in for the Whitman folks. I should make it clear that for today's discussion, at least, Duff was in this campaign, in the primary, talking to all the candidates, all the campaigns, was a part of all of those. So I didn't mean to just make him a, quote, Whitman person. So let me ask you about Poizner and his thinking. You might have had some conversations with him.
Yes. First of all, though, deciding to run for office in a lot of ways is kind of like dating and when you decide to get married. For some people, it was very clear the first time they saw the person, they knew they were going to marry them. But for most people, it's kind of a gradual process. And sometimes you think you're going to do it, and then a month later you say, oh my gosh, I don't think I'm going to, and you end up doing it anyway. So I think you have to kind of keep that process in mind when you're looking at these campaigns. But to just kind of go through the list, I do a lot of work with the people up in Sacramento, and by fall of 2007, Jerry clearly was sending the signal to the third-party people that he was probably going to make a run. I remember meeting with him, I think it was in the summer of 2009, when he had already raised $8 million. He was trying to say, hey, I don't know if I'm running. And I said, hey, Jerry, there's 8 million reasons that I know that you probably are. And he said, 8.3 million. So, I mean, clearly there was a point where he was moving ahead. With respect to Steve, after he won the election, he did look at it. his consultants at that time were encouraging him to run for the Senate, not for the governor's race. And so he was kind of trying to decide whether or not he wanted to run for the Senate, governor, or just run for re-election as insurance commissioner, because it was unclear what the environment was going to be. And if you remember, in 2008, it wasn't a great environment for Republicans, and it was unclear what it was going to be in 2010. But I think by January of 2008, he had started the wheels in motion to possibly run for governor in 2010.
Can we stick with that for a second? In January of 2008, the Los Angeles Times, a newspaper dear to my heart, reports that Meg Whitman is talking to prominent Republicans about a run for governor. Again, this is in January of 2008. Are you aware of those conversations and what her thinking was at that time?
Yes, and again, I would put her process more in the step-by-step dating process. Is that in her mind there were 5, 10, 27 things that she needed to consider, and she was in her in her former life she was a business consultant, and she was very methodically going through her checklist and deciding whether or not it was something that made sense to her. So she did what I thought was an excellent job of going around the state, listening to people, getting their input, and by January of 2008, she was seriously considering it.
And she had a role. I know she spoke at the convention, the Republican convention. She did a lot of stuff on the road. She was very close to Mitt Romney, did a lot of surrogate sort of stuff. Did she ever talk about how that taste of it made her, obviously didn't turn her off, but maybe enticed her into getting into the race?
Yeah, I think that going around the state and with Mitt and having the opportunity to meet with different governors was a real eye-opening experience to her. I know she especially was impressed with people like Jeb Bush and the work that he was doing in terms of education reform, Bobby Jindal, and the healthcare in Louisiana. So I think that did raise her interest in possibly running for governor because of what she saw from her meetings with the governors through her relationship with Mitt.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I mean, it was, and this is a good lesson in how what you do at the beginning really affects the end of the campaign. I mean, she was very clearly running for governor early. She hired Steve Schmidt, who was my boss in the Schwarzenegger campaign in 2006, very early in 2008, paid him an exorbitant amount of money to advise her, one of Arnold's consultants. She then invested $1 million in Mike Murphy's film company. Very hard to believe that was just a random investment idea that came to her. So she very quickly said, I want to run as a kind of Arnold different Republican. And as we saw from the commercial that the Brown campaign did that was devastating, one of the best commercials of this cycle, those early decisions really come back to bite you late in the campaign.
Yeah, well, Jamie, if we can bring you in, Duff was talking about how Mr. Poizner's thought process was early on was, do I run for Senate? Do I run for governor? Obviously, Mr. Campbell went through that same process, maybe in reverse. What was his, do you think, what opportunity did he see and decide to get in very early and say, by golly, I'm running for governor?
Well, I first joined his campaign, I think it was in April of 2009, it would have been. He had already had a committee open, I think, as of December of the prior year. When I talked to him at that point, we talked nothing but governor, and his focus was in the governor's race. I mean, he was talking about how it could happen, how it might not happen. I think his evolution toward the end of the race was, as we watched what was happening, I think that the signature moment in his decision to start considering the Senate race an alternative was Meg's early radio buy, and he saw how quickly she was able to drive her name ID and her numbers up in a vacuum. He just couldn't conceive at that point that he wasn't going to have to raise a great deal of money to compete, even in that hypothetical, murder-suicide scenario. He had to really think hard about whether he could raise the money to stay in the race, not just win as a default candidate.
Right, but then he did the polling in December of 2009, which showed that he matched up really well against Boxer, and I think that had to be a significant factor in his decision to make the switch.
Sure, we did the poll for him, and it was a decision. I would say any poll taken, I think we understood this that early, regarding the Senate race, was a name ID poll. but it did tell us a little bit about the dynamics and was a huge factor in whether or not we stayed in the governor's race. And the fact that it was, conceivable to get through the primary on the other side versus the spending we were going to be up against in the governor's side. I mean, he was honest about that and very blunt about it.
All right. If I could turn over to the Democratic side, where there was no primary, Steve says. Right after the general election was over, Art Pulaski and a number of top labor officials had a debriefing where they talked about their role in the general campaign. But he says its origins came right after the 2006 gubernatorial election, and they, at that point, decided among themselves, we cannot allow what happened in 2006 to happen again, where the Democratic nominee gets blown out the day after the primary, and we're going to marshal our resources and put together a strategy to make sure that doesn't happen. So I guess my question, and we start with Peter, clearly there was a mindset on the part of many in the Democratic donor community that we're not going to fund a primary. And Jerry Brown is the one with the name ID and has a pretty strong lead in the personal preference polls early. Can you talk about how that might have affected the ability of any of the potential challengers to proceed with their plans?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is that from the beginning, we always knew that if we were going to win a Democratic primary, it would have to be an outsider campaign. That a lot of the insiders, traditional, conventional insiders, I guess I'm one also, but a lot of the insiders would not coalesce around any particular candidate, and that had been clear. Those of us who were on the Democratic side had lived through the last primary, understood that. It was very interesting. It's an interesting point that you bring up. There was never any outright hostility towards Gavin Newsom from labor or from traditional donors. In fact, most of what we got from that crowd, if you will, is let's wait and see. Let's wait and see how it goes. You go out and prove yourself, and then we'll see where it goes. Now, in Jerry's case, Jerry Brown's case, Governor Brown, I think they were very smart about how they did it, which is that they were able to go to, in the early days when he hadn't made an official decision about what he was going to do, was able to go to labor leaders and others and say, you should support us, but we have this, this account that's, could be for AG, it could be for governor, et cetera. And they were able to raise a lot of money. I mean, everyone knows the numbers, but I think on 10/16, of 09 when Gavin dropped out, Jerry had to raise $11 million. I think at that point, that's what I was looking at this morning, and we raised 3.6 in total. And so there was never any overt hostility. There was never.
Not going to hostility, but was there just a sense that we can't afford a contest, and we wish you well, we like your guy, but we need to marshal our money.
Yeah, I think it was more, if you go out and prove yourself, then we'll have a conversation. But until then, they have the same numbers we have, that are right here. It was clear to them, as it was to us, that we were, we had a real mountain to climb.
We'll come back to fundraising and performance, but I want to back up and ask you another question. Gavin Newsom, and this time I'll get it right, was reelected. Second term as San Francisco mayor. He looks in the mirror, he's thinking about his future, he doesn't see a senator, he doesn't see a lieutenant governor, he sees a governor. So what's his thinking?
When he
decides to run for governor, yeah. There's a whole panoply of offices he could run for. Lieutenant governor is a nice one. But he wants to run for governor. So what's his thinking? We'll get to that. But what was his thinking? Why Gavin Newsom? Why governor of California?
Sure, and I'll impart some of my personal experiences with this topic. I remember in probably January, February of '08. I was in Austin, Texas. I was down there with Hillary, and then they were there for South by Southwest. And I remember talking to him. I was on a run. He called me, and we really started to talk about this in earnest. Where are we going to go? How are we going to do this? What's out there? And Gavin Newsom was a very successful mayor of a large city, and you can look at that in a myriad of ways. You can look at it from just a pure political perspective, and all of our polling in the Bay Area had always had him as a very popular figure, even to this day. It's always been that way. But also from a policy perspective, I would argue that he was the most successful mayor in a generation in San Francisco. So, as a chief executive of San Francisco, where he's done, without questions, done some of the most innovative policy work in the country, it made sense from our perspective to look at another chief executive role. And the governors at the time, everybody, and now voters continue to believe this, Sacramento really needed to be shaken up. So that was our thinking about it.
When you guys were looking at this race, and as you said, there was a lot of names. Jerry Brown, obviously, even though Jerry might not have made up his mind, a lot of people thought he was going to be running. Jerry Brown, Jackie Spear, John Garamendi, whose name should not go unmentioned. He was in the race. He left. He's in Congress now. But
we polled him too.
Okay, when you're looking at this race on sort of the scale of a slam dunk, sure thing on the one hand, and the star, the sun, the moon need to line up perfectly on the other. When you guys looked at this race, what was your thinking on that spectrum?
Sure. Then there was another meeting that we did at, I think we did it at Plumpjack headquarters in San Francisco. And this was before we had, brought on any outside consultants, our campaign manager, et cetera. This was a, small group of family and close advisors. And we talked about it. We talked about all the different options. And it was a tough decision because, particularly for myself, a fellow by the name of Jason Kinney, who you all know, we knew that the mayor had just been remarried. We know that we knew that the family was going to start soon, and that's a really complicated situation. One of the things, Duff, you mentioned, when you go through the process of deciding if you're going to run, as political hacks and journalists, you don't quite understand how intense an experience it is to make that decision, and all the things that you have to go through, and all the things you have to decide. And the mayor was able to look at all those different things, and we had a frank discussion about the family. We had a frank discussion about the city. He loves San Francisco so deeply. And he made the decision with his wife, Jennifer, who I'm very, very fond of. But a little plug for her, she's at Sundance this weekend, watch her movie. They are, it was an intensely personal decision for them, and it was what Gavin Newsom believed was best for him, his family, and most importantly, the state of California. It's where he thought he could have the most impact.
And when he looked at the race and sized it up, did he think it was going to be a long shot? He had even odds, better than even odds? I mean, when you looked at it, when you guys talked about it, what did you guys figure?
Sure. We, again, in November 2008, we did some polling. Our pollster was a fellow by the name of Joel Benenson, who was Barack Obama's pollster, and by all accounts is one of the best in the country. And coincidentally, I interned for him in 1994. Our numbers at the time was, we did a four-way, we did a five-way. We had Jerry was at 36, Governor Brown now Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom was at 13, Garamendi was at 13, Villaraigosa, we did it in a five-way only at a 60. But basically what you see is that from our perspective, again, as I said earlier, it was a very fluid race. And in politics, as in life, and this is a Gavin Newsom quote that he lifted from Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And we decided to take a shot.
So just real quickly, the presumption then was that Jerry would have been the front runner. So the fight was then going to emerge as the anti-Jerry or the alternative to Jerry. Who did you folks see as the main competition at that point when you were looking at a whole? Was it Villaraigosa? Who was it?
Well, the interesting thing about it, I'll just read you a blurb here from Joel's memo. Villaraigosa's entry is more likely to benefit Brown than Newsom. Essentially, what what had happened at that time was that, as we viewed it at the time, was that the more people who were in there, the more the support came from Governor Brown, now Governor Brown. And that is because each person would take a little bit out of his big pie. So again, from our perspective, we weren't sure if Jerry Brown was running. And at the time, it was shaping up to be a multi-candidate primary. And so, again, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And again, just take a step back, and I'll draw upon my personal experience with Lieutenant Governor Newsom over all the titles. I'm getting all confused, the new titles. But if my drawing on my personal experience with him over 7 years is that, he's willing to take risks if he thinks that it's worth it for the people that he serves and the things that he believes in. I mean, obviously, everybody knows that from 2004 with same-sex marriage, but I could give you a myriad of examples of that, whether it be universal health care that he did in San Francisco, anything, even down to the smallest type things. And so that's the kind of person he is.
Okay. Well, one more, we definitely will get to this Republican side where there actually was a primary that went down to Election Day. But a quick question for Sterling and Steve. After Mayor Newsom dropped out in October, at one point, Governor Brown said, we'll make an announcement when the first snow falls in the Sierra. And then it wasn't until nearly the filing deadline in March when he... I guess what
it was a drought year.
I think it was a normal precipitation year, actually. But so I guess how, as it turned out, how important do you think was that ability to wait until March, to stay dark, to keep out of the limelight while the Republicans are shooting bullets at each other? I'm sorry, now that we're into the new age of more civil discourse, we're throwing stones at each other, or maybe throwing marshmallows at each other. How important was it for you to be able to stay dark and stay out of the limelight and let the focus be on the other side?
Well, certainly it was valuable, but to be frank about it, I think that whether Gavin had stayed in the race or not, the way I saw it was that we were going to be able to go through the primary spending very little money and trying to hold the center and not be pulled to the left by a potential primary campaign. So it wasn't as if we were feeling under threat in 09 when Ragosa dropped out in the summer, I believe. I didn't begin working with Jerry until August of 09 in a formal capacity. So it really wasn't so much about whether there's one person in the race or two. It was about how do we conserve our resources for the general election fight, not just financial resources, but political resources in terms of our ability to capture the center. So,
but beyond that, being the presumptive nominee from pretty much November through March, when the announcement was finally closed, was it valuable to not just conserving resources, but to be able to stay in the shadows while all the rhetoric and the focus was on the other side?
Well, I don't think we were in the shadows because he was doing his job as Attorney General and doing it effectively, and there was a public component to that.
I'm not suggesting that he wasn't.
But as I said at the time, there's a time for politics and there's a time for doing your job and public policy. And it was in our interest to not rush ahead and get into the political mud pen in any way. I mean, I think the one worry that I had as we went through that fall period into the new year was Meg Whitman going to use her resources to use Jerry Brown as the foil to be a stronger Republican? And one prediction that proved to not be correct on was I thought that she would, even before the new year struck, that she would start to use Jerry Brown and start to raise our negatives by running against us as the presumptive Republican nominee. And we, I expected that all the way through until primary day. I was very surprised that actually never happened. And we heard a lot of stuff, particularly in the month of March, that she had cut an ad against Jerry and was ready to put it on the air. It was imminent. That never came to play. So we were interested in conserving our resources. We were interested in not becoming a political candidate early, and that's how we conducted ourselves.
I want to turn now. I want to ask Duff a question. Duff is certainly going to be earning the thousands of dollars they're paying him today. But no, actually, you should get an extra bottle of water or two for all this. And again, I don't mean to put you on the hot seat, but to bring it forward a little bit, we're going to move to February of 2009, at which point Gavin Newsom has formed an exploratory committee. Tom Campbell has. John Garamandy's in. Meg Whitman forms her exploratory committee, and then 2 days later, or I guess it would have been the next day, sits down for a fateful interview with a colleague of mine at the LA Times, where she is seen, fair to say, I think, within political circles, among hacks and other campaign obsessives, as showing herself not necessarily being ready for prime time. She stumbles over questions about same-sex marriage, some immigration stuff, and that brings me to the question, you know, Meg Whitman took a lot of grief for being inaccessible for a very, very long time. Can you talk a little bit about their thinking? I mean, did this not so good interview sort of reinforce their notion that we had to keep her under wraps? You know, was that a mistake because of all the blowback she suffered? You know, this image of her skirting reporters and not being accessible?
I can't address that. I don't know what the campaign's thought process was on that. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is that I think the first important element of the general election was the fact that Brown did not have a primary opponent. And I think if you look at Gavin Newsom, and when he was in the race, Brown initially came out and indicated that he was going to support Proposition 8 in the courts. And then when Newsom got into the race, he changed his position. And I think that we on our side expected that to happen down the line, that he would have to go to the left on issue after issue, and then would have to try to come back to the center in the general election. So I think that was the first major element. Clearly, when you're running for governor for the first time or running for office for the first time, as was Meg's case, I think they did have certain missteps early on, and you point to one of them. Clearly it wasn't the only one, but I think it's pretty typical for a first-time candidate to confuse what they did extremely well, especially when she was so successful in the business world, and think, okay, those skills are transferable. And I think that we saw that clearly there is a steep learning curve there.
I want to come back to the Republican folks, but Steve, can you respond to what Duff suggested? The fact that Governor Brown did not have a primary opponent. I will stipulate he is a man who is guided by principle, who does not focus on politics, those sorts of things. But that said, the fact that he did not have an opponent, did that allow him to hug the middle more than he might otherwise if he'd been running against an opponent to his left?
I don't think so. I just don't think so. I mean, Duff made one example, but I can't really speak to that. And he certainly, his politics had evolved over time, and his mayorship of Oakland made him very pragmatic on a lot of different things. And so there certainly was an evolution, but I wouldn't say that a primary opponent was really going to drive that. Even the polling that Gavin had, had jury up 20, 30 points. Some of the other private polling had us way ahead. To be honest, we never felt threatened at any point in the primary season. I mean, there was one point there was a rumor that Diane was going to get in January, and that went away. So I don't really think it had any effect.
Peter, inviting you to speculate, do you think Governor Brown would have evolved the way he evolved had he not had someone running from his left? You're smiling. What do you think?
Well,
Go ahead, speculate away.
In the 10 years I've been here, I think that Jerry Brown is Jerry Brown. I don't think that it's the right answer. Trust me. I really believe that. I mean, you remember that when Gavin Newsom was first mayor, Jerry Brown was mayor of Oakland, and I remember going to events with the two of them. We did a fair amount of events together. Jerry Brown is who he is. It's not. It's just, you can say what you want about him and all of that, but he's going to do what he thinks is right. That's it.
If I could go over now to the Poizner campaign and get them to react to a couple things that were just said. One, Steve just said that the Brown campaign anticipated and was surprised that Meg Whitman did not try to make him the focus of or at least part of the focus of her primary. And from your perspective, did it become more difficult, not only that there wasn't a contested Democratic primary, but would it have been helpful to you had the Democrat been out there more visible campaigning to make the Democrat more a focus of your campaign?
Well, it's interesting when you ask Peter what Gavin Newsom was thinking when he looked in the mirror. We always thought that he thought, hey, you know, I have a great hairdo, better hairdo than Jerry, and, you know, I should be governor. We thought that was very clear.
Who was yours the hair primary?
I mean, obviously, we would have liked to see them have a Democratic primary. It always gives you something to play against when you have your opponents out there. We tried to do a little bit of what Steve was talking about. In April of 2009, we put out a press release. Nobody paid any attention to it. Jerry Brown's 40th anniversary in politics. What a long, strange trip it's been. And, you know, it gets no play. The Whitman campaign, with their money, was able to really be the base that the campaign kind of played around. It exerted its own gravity because it was such a large thing in the race. With Jerry kind of sitting back, it really kind of de-emphasized the interest in the campaign. And one thing we haven't really talked about here is that this might have been the first race in kind of a post-press environment, where with all the layoffs in the newspapers, all the kind of layoffs on TV, the press didn't have the effect. And, you know, one of the campaigns, which isn't here to defend itself, really ignored the press as much as they could. So that had a big, if you would have had a Newsom-Brown fight, I think it would have brought more interest to the entire race, and it might have let us get into the conversation more earlier.
That's a good point. I want to come back later asking guys about what you call this post-press environment, but from the Campbell and from the Poizner perspective, I mean, let's point out Steve Poizner spent about $25 million, which is not an insignificant sum, but you're sitting there, and Meg Whitman gives this not terribly impressive interview to the LA Times, and yet she's sitting on this huge pile of money. When you folks are sort of looking at the Campbell folks and the Poizner folks, sitting and looking at this race, knowing that she's just got this enormous sum of money, what's your thinking at that point in terms of strategy and where it might go and how competitive it's going to be or not?
Well, you think, what are your advantages and what are your disadvantages? Our advantage is where we had a candidate who was clearly not ready for prime time, had not been through this before. On the other side that we could run against, our disadvantage was we had a candidate that was willing to outspend us by tens of millions of dollars. So you try to fight the battles on the ground that's most advantageous to you. Have debates between them. Go out and talk to people. Respect the process. Go out and talk to voters. Try to show a contrast. The sad part is, in a kind of post-press environment, it's hard to get much traction out of that because people get so much of their information still today from TV.
Jamie, from the Campbell perspective, I think you were sort of the pauper in the race. He had ideas, but not a lot of money. So from your perspective, you're sitting there and looking at Steve Poizner with a lot of money, Meg Whitman with a super duper lot of money, and Tom Campbell kind of living off the land.
Well, we fell into a period. Is this on? We fell into a period there where we almost sort of felt like a conscience in the race in terms of trying to work with earned media, trying to put ideas out there. We actually had thought about, I know the federal dynamic this year with the Tea Party, et cetera, was looking for outsiders and newcomers. We weren't so sure that the state dynamic was looking for inexperience and for the executive position in the state. And so we felt very comfortable, at least as far as our earned media efforts were going, trying to replace that sort of void there with ideas, some that were popular, some that were unpopular. But I think, the dynamic that played out in the general election between Brown and Whitman, people choosing experience, et cetera, I think we thought that would come into play. I mean, like I said, we didn't stay, obviously, in the race because we also thought money would come into play. But that was our thinking.
Duff, yeah.
As somebody that was working with both campaigns, what we did is what was called a conjoint analysis. And what that does, it looks at the various characteristics that candidates embody. What is their experience? What is their position on key issues? And you do a statistical analysis, and the computer spits out and says, okay, this candidate is very attractive to the California voters in these areas, has real concerns in this area. What it doesn't take into account is how well the campaigns are run or how much money they have. And the interesting thing was, if you just did the conjoint analysis of the profile and where they stood on the issues, Steve and Meg were very close. And also in the early numbers in terms of ID, they were very close. So as a Republican, we were really concerned if this primary went on, because since they were so close on the issues, it really was going to come down to a very nasty personal fight. And so that's why we were hopeful that one or the other would take the lead. Now, Meg took the approach of going real heavy, real early with the money and trying to freeze the Poizner campaign out. I'm not going to speak for Jim or what they were thinking, but from what I was able to see, until that Arizona law was passed in April of 2007, what they were doing was not having an impact on the voters. But once Arizona passed that anti-immigrant law, that gave Steve the opening, and I think they were very effective in terms of the ads that they ran, which enabled them to take what had been a sizable gap and get it to the point where the race was down to single digits. And while that was extremely effective in the primary, if you're talking in terms of the steps of the general election, I would say that was step number 2 to Meg's defeat, because that made her negative numbers shoot way up, and those negative numbers never went down again.
Yeah, you know, I want to get in. You talked about that swing where Whitman started early, had a big lead, then it narrowed, and then opened up again. Speaking to someone closely affiliated with the Whitman campaign this week, who unfortunately can't be identified, but is it what they were hopeful that they would be able to draw out the Poizner campaign and get you engaged in spending money sooner than you had hoped for, and they thought that had worked, and then you didn't have resources to take advantage of that momentum that came after the Arizona law, after some of your early advertising. There was clearly some movement, and then it was stopped. Anything to that? I mean, did you start too early, and were you short on money to seize the moment?
It's amazing how the conversation changes. We did a press, behind-the-scenes press meeting with some of the folks in this audience at the Republican convention in March of 2010. And every question was, why aren't you up on TV already? Why aren't you up on TV?
No, I know that the pressure was coming from there.
The pressure
Same thing happened to
right. The pressure was
Jerry
coming
Brown,
from anybody,
who
and we held back, and we said we're going to start 45 to 60 days out. What Duff's analysis ignores is that we really didn't go on TV in size until April. Now that is.
I'm sorry. I agree with you, Jim.
Yeah.
I wasn't taking this position.
Right. We didn't go on TV in size until April. So we waited as long as we thought possible. I mean, when you're sitting in February and you're sitting watching the Super Bowl and Meg Whitman's on TV 5 months before the election, and you know she has the resources to do that, and I'm sitting there looking at my bank account and saying, we don't have the resources to go on TV. And then the one thing that should also...
You were on the air some in March. My notes here say that March 1st you started.
And the reason we started in March is something that I think is, I don't know if it's ever happened, Jarrod, you could speak to this in a campaign before. A person with a 50-point lead, Meg Whitman, her consultants, gave her the advice to go on TV and attack Steve Poizner before he had ran a single ad. So a person with a 50-point lead goes on TV before we run an ad. That is a sign that the campaign is going to be very bloody, that they're going to try. That's actually a sign of weakness, because it shows that they felt they needed to go out and assassinate Steve Poizner's character. The first ad was, we can't trust Steve Poizner. It was a characterological attack. So, we waited as long as we thought we could. We had to respond to that small, but we didn't go on with our main buy until mid-April.
We're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the blood and the guts and the mud that was slung, but I want to go back to Duff's analysis, which my reading, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically suggests that pretty much from the get-go, or at least early on, it evolved into a Poizner-Whitman contest. It was going to be one of those two. So my question for Jamie is that what you folks were seeing? And if so, before he switched races, before he left the Senate race, given that model, what was his path to victory as he saw it? Tom Campbell.
A couple things. One of the, I guess, theories that we were working with is that although the early numbers that Meg was able to drive up in a vacuum were high, you have to be able to work with the decision-making timeline that voters have. And you can rent voters early in a race, but that does not mean, as the Poizner campaign showed early on when it closed to single digits, that was how voters were going to vote. When the other candidates are way ahead of you, and actually we were hanging in there for a little while in terms of our numbers based on name identification, Meg could rent as many votes as she wanted for a period of time. The voters at some point were going to come, engage the race, and make their decision. We had a durable base in the Bay Area. We had a brand, and we had what we thought was experience versus Whitman. Poizner had experience, so we weren't in that category. But as I said earlier, unlike the federal dynamic with the Tea Party and the newcomers, we thought that voters would reward some level of experience in the primary. And the only question was, could we raise the money? And Tom has been, I know there was sort of an assumption that he has not been a good fundraiser in the past. We always were curious about that because he used to be praised for his fundraising prowess. Only in the campaign against Feinstein did he not raise money, but he's raised $23 million over his career. Problem was, our donors were some of the same ones that tended to support Whitman, and we were being blocked in that regard. Once we decided we could not get through that, and Tom went on to the other race and actually the clock ran out, but he actually was raising money at quite a heavy clip, as he is historically.
What was your thinking? We're talking about a Republican primary. We're not talking about a soon-to-be blanket ballot, open primary, that sort of, call it what you will. We're talking about a closed Republican primary. What was it that made you think, and I hesitate to use these labels, and I'll use them loosely, but for discussion's sake, a moderate, or at least someone less conservative than the two who are running. What was your presumption that a moderate could win a California Republican primary?
Well, a couple things. One, as I said, we thought there was a durable base in the Bay Area that we had geographically that would stick. I think that showed itself even in the Senate race. The second thing is we did feel, and this played out in the Senate race as well, where we were attacked quite a bit. Tom has a durability. It's hard to drive Tom Campbell's negatives up. It just is. You can position him as a moderate, but people tend to say, yeah, he's a moderate, I like him anyway. We didn't know what the other campaigns were going to do. If they went negative on each other and drove their personal negativity up, we had a shot, as long as we were able to raise our own pot of money. So that was our thinking. Eventually, we realized that we were not going to be able to reach a threshold to communicate with San Diego, LA voters in particular. So we had to go look at the Senate race, and the rest you know.
So this might have been, for those of us who've been around, this might have been the Gray Davis murder-suicide strategy?
I've seen the analyses on that. I'm not sure I buy them all. We weren't looking at that purely. Otherwise, we might have stayed in the race. We still felt like we had to get to a threshold of communication with particularly Southern California voters to augment what we thought was a Bay Area base. In the end, we realized we couldn't do it.
Yeah, well, let's. I want to now get into this April when things were really engaged, and the gap started to close a little bit. Now, one thing I'm curious about, and Poizner, clearly in a Republican primary, the battle oftentimes is who's the true conservative. That was one of your only one ads. You had Tom McClintock as a validator, but given you knew what the Whitman campaign had against your candidate to counter that. Did you really think that you could win the true conservative argument given the donation to Al Gore, the support for the 55% school bond thing? You knew they were going to come back with that. What made you think you could win the true conservative argument?
Well, because we were able to close the gap pretty quickly. I think we were able to win that argument for a while until she switched and took a very hard stance. It's pretty common knowledge to everyone here that her ads didn't even mention the word Republican or conservative for 6 months. And when you're running in a Republican primary and you're ashamed of the word Republican, then you may not be the true conservative. I think that, Steve felt that he had stronger stances on policy issues, more conservative stances on policy issues than Meg. One of those was in 2009, she held the press conference at the border where she advocated for Barack Obama's immigration policy. Now, she had...
I thought your ad said it was the president of Mexico's immigration policy.
Well, both. She did both. But anyways, my point is, if she had come out and held a press conference to say, I want to raise your taxes, we would have gone with that as the differentiating issue. There were differentiating issues. In a Republican primary, any primary, you're not going to get a lot of policy difference necessarily. There was a policy difference on immigration, and we drove pretty hard with it. But that was a kind of legitimate substance policy issue, whereas some of the issues you were mentioning, if he had given to Al Gore 10 years ago, that I don't know would have affected his role as governor. That's not a specific policy issue that would have been debated. And I think that that was part of why we knew we could pull it off. And I think part of it too was a lot of you go back to the LA Times interview. Well, I do think, and this is something that certainly for people who are getting into politics and want to be in politics, and I run into this in campaigns all over the country. Yeah, one of what made Steve a better candidate was that he was sitting down and talking to reporters. He didn't skip editorial boards. He did town hall meetings. He answered every question across the board. As the campaign went on, people may disagree with his policy positions, but he became a much better candidate because he was able to sit in and answer hard questions. I think that anytime you have a candidate that is going to avoid, if they're getting advice to avoid the press, it makes them not as good of a candidate going down the line. And that was something we were seeing developing when small skirmishes happened. Not skirmishes, but small scandals blew up into big scandals. One-day stories blew up into two-day stories. They blew up into two-week stories. Ultimately, that kind of foreshadowed what happened in the general election. But there was a lot where, we were kind of riding a little bit of a momentum, and we were hoping to sustain that till the end. Now, obviously, we weren't able to.
Can I add just something real quick on that? Not only did we think we could win, we were winning. When we, in April and May, went up at $2 million a week, 1,000 points statewide, everywhere besides San Francisco, in our internal polling, we went ahead everywhere except San Francisco, having the conservative versus moderate. I mean, Meg ran for a year and a half, New California, everything the wise men in Sacramento love, reaching across the aisle, don't mention you're a Republican, it's all about new groups. That's we were winning that race. And then boom, she rebooted. And Meg 2.0, all of a sudden, she was against amnesty too. And she was running conservative. She was running our message on TV, and she had the resources that she spent more in the last month on TV and mail running our message than we spent in the entire campaign, and she blew us out.
Can I ask Jamie and Duff, not necessarily from the Whitman perspective, but just as a general proposition, they threw out the notion that there's a price to be paid not talking to reporters, and I would suggest there's a lot of people in the public who don't like. I mean, they like Timm, but they don't like people like me. Is there a downside to not talking to reporters? Was it a mistake? Okay. Why? What's the mistake? Why not just ignore us and do your YouTube and your Facebook and your blah, blah? Why deal with jerks like me?
Well, because if you get elected governor, you're going to have to deal with everybody. So I think it's important to develop those relationships. And I think the broader your base is, whether it's with the media or Democrats in the legislature, whoever you're going to have to deal with down the line, I think it's important if you're authentic that you do that from the point in time when you're comfortable doing that. I don't think you necessarily have to do it from day one, but you clearly, I don't think over time you can turn your back on any key group.
Jamie?
I mean, I would second that, just in the context of the campaign. I mean, there's a couple axes that you work with your message. You work with your message and what it says, and you have the other axis, which is your credibility and your authenticity with the voters. Voters are no longer just spoon-feeding themselves whatever you put on TV. They need to see it confirmed and affirmed by the way you behave in those earned media public events. One of the largest events of the entire campaign was an earned media event. Despite $140 million worth of spending, one earned media event was the sort of anchor in people's minds about how to put a context on the race. If you're avoiding those real life situations, voters are never able to take your message and see it processed in real life. And I think any ad maker will tell you today that the line is getting higher and higher for people to just take your ads, digest them, and say, that's how I'm voting. They want to see you in real life, and that's the downside. I don't know why she took so long to do it. We actually thought when she did at the Republican convention, she did fine. We were surprised. Why wait?
Just to jump in, I mean, I totally agree. I watched about every interview she did and reviewed every editorial board, and she actually was very good. I couldn't find stuff to attack her on once she started talking, but it never helps in the long run. And again, you may win a primary, you may win the election, but then once you get in there, it's not going to help. And I know we're talking about California, but it happens all over the country. I think you're seeing a wave of that. And it's a big issue now, and I do think, especially the people who are trying to get in to politics, I've worked on so many campaigns where the campaign manager or consultant comes along and says, don't talk to the press, don't talk to the press. Well, I think that's one of the things why Steve still today has a good relationship with the press, because he was able to talk to them. It makes you a better candidate and helps you in the long run. And anytime somebody's coming along and telling you, avoid the media, they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I want to go back over to Steve for a second, follow up on the point Jim just made, that the Poizner campaign forced the Whitman campaign to, in late April and May, to start responding back on the conservative issue, and including and perhaps we can talk about this later, might have been a bit of a turning point when she did the Pete Wilson ad with Pete Wilson saying she'll be tough as nails on immigration, illegal immigration. What are you guys thinking at this time when you're watching this unfold, and what the spillover effects might have been?
Well, I think you are passing over some other noteworthy events that happened in the spring. But in particular, you had the Chamber of Commerce went up with an ad against us, you may recall. But I agree with what Jim said, that I thought that the Poizner campaign was playing it all correctly in waiting, and they were subject to a lot of criticism about that, about waiting, and I thought that they did play it as well as they could, and certainly we enjoyed the show. The Democratic Party, we did see Whitman as a bigger threat, and we were happy to see the Democratic Party engage in early May.
Let me stop you there. Bigger threat, why? Because she had this Silicon Valley background, because of the money? I mean, bigger threat, why?
Cha-ching.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
I don't want to be quoted on that. I'm only kidding.
The golden rule in politics.
We'll come back to Norway. I want to bring Peter into this conversation, and then we'll be done. You can catch your flight to Sundance. The governor thing isn't going so good for Gavin Newsom, right? He's going to be the Facebook guy, and he's going to do the this and the that and all that. I mean, what happened? I mean, you got in this race thinking that, Wayne Gretzky, take your shot. There's the net, not an open net, taking a shot. It doesn't work out. What fizzled? Why did it fizzle? What happened?
Well, before we even start that, just to tell you about the Post media, I've been watching everybody's tweets through here on my iPad, so we'll talk afterwards. Yeah, see, he took his out now. I was talking to then Mayor just about every day. I still talk to him every day, but I was talking to him just about every day about all this. And the statement that we put out was a statement that we crafted. We were very careful about what we said.
What statement were we talking about?
Statement when he left.
And to paraphrase or sum it up?
I'll read it to you. It's, and I actually lifted it off of Phil's blog this morning. With a young family and responsibilities at City Hall, I found it impossible to commit the time required to complete this effort in the way it needs to and should be done.
Okay, now, all right, so let's back up. I will stipulate Gavin is a loving, he's a devoted husband, loving father.
No, let me just stop for 1 second.
Okay.
And for those of you in the room who are parents, his daughter was born on September 18th. And it was, anyone who's been through the first few weeks knows it's not easy. And it's harder than you even think it's going to be.
He didn't know he was going to be a parent when he got involved. He had a little something to do with that child being produced, right? I mean, he knew this going in.
Before I was a parent, I didn't know what it meant.
Let me ask you this. All right, again,
everyone who has children will understand.
I'm willing to stipulate Gavin is a loving father.
By the way, you have great children too.
I think I do. That explains all the gray hair. Loving father, devoted husband, good, solid family man. If he was leaving the polls and he was rolling in money, he would have just said, "By God, I'm gonna step down, even though I'm ahead and I've got all this money. I'm gonna give my money to, Haitian orphans and go be a dad."
Fair question, Mark. But listen to again, the statement that we put out was we're very specific about it. It's a when you going back to the thing that Duff said originally, and we had talked about before. This is an intensely personal experience to make a decision like this, and there are there are more factors that go into it than just what your polling numbers are. And I can only say this because I was there, and I lived through it as close as I can. And yes, the political landscape was complicated for us. And Jerry's, Governor Brown's numbers in our polling in the, over the summer, he had gone up, In some ways, we were kind of the victims of our own success because we were doing pretty well. We had, we were getting, I remember the town hall meeting we did in Santa Monica. We had, 500-600 people show up, and we did, with email and Facebook and all those kind of things, and it was pretty exciting. And for a variety of other reasons, everybody else got out of the race, and we were down to a one-on-one race, which we actually knew from our early polling was a problem. But
a problem? Why?
Because the more people that were in the race, the more it came out of Jerry Brown's larger pie.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Gavin is the outsider.
Wait, let me just finish that.
Okay.
It's a bunch of factors that go into a decision like this, and the personal stuff was actually very, very significant. And it was really hard. But it was a whole bunch of different things. And in order to get to where we need to be, there was just the mayor at the time didn't feel like he could do it.
So to back up a minute, you've got Jerry Brown right where you want him, right? It's a one-on-one race.
No, I said that's the opposite. No, that was the opposite. What I was saying is
okay, fair enough. But new, different, vibrant, good-looking mayor of San Francisco, this old retread guy who's been around, he's as old as dirt, and you're young and new and dynamic. I mean, why didn't it? Yeah, the hair. Why didn't it come together for him? Okay, notwithstanding that you don't have all these people carving up the pie, why didn't it come together? Outsider. Last year was not a great year for established office holders. Why didn't it come together?
With all, the truth of the matter is that the Brown campaign did a great job in how they approached the primary, and I'm not just saying that because Steve's sitting next to me. I think everybody agrees. The voters at the time were supporting Jerry Brown. They had known him. They had good feelings about him. In fact, again, just going back to some of our polling, at the time, around 2000, when this poll was done in the summer of 2009, while the mayor is doing phenomenally well amongst young people, we had a plus 25 difference in our polling. Voters 45 and over were very much supportive of Jerry Brown in the Democratic primary. These are all Democratic primary numbers. We're very much supportive of Jerry Brown. And in order for the mountain for us was a hard one to climb. And given all of the other things that were going on and his dedication to the city, he personally made a decision. He didn't think that it was going to work.
Finally, how much of it?
By the way, we're very happy the way things turned out.
Well, we'll come back to that in time. But how much of it was the fact that, so I'm told, Gavin didn't like to raise money, had to be pushed into raising money, didn't like to pick up the phone and do the things that a candidate has to do to run?
Well, it's funny. I thought you might ask.
Yeah, well, there you go. You're shuffling paper. All right, here it comes.
Oh, you can say that too. I won't. I won't say. Can you guys hear what he's whispering to me? Okay. You're right. But let me just talk a little bit about Gavin Newsom's ability to raise money. In the governor's race from July 08 to October 10, he raised $3.6 million. In the lieutenant governor's race from March 10th to the 10th of this year, October 10th of 2010, he raised $4.7 million. All told, he raised $8.1 million in the last cycle. I'm just a guy who can raise money outside of the top of the ticket. $8.1 million. I'm pretty certain that was a pretty significant haul. So I actually, my personal experience is that, and by the way, that doesn't even take into account that he's probably the best citywide fundraiser in the history of San Francisco. The folks from the Chronicle here will know that better than I will, but I'm certain of it. The larger point I'm making is that Gavin Newsom actually does raise money. He has raised money, and that, again, we all know that Governor Brown had a significant financial advantage. However, it's just one factor that goes into this decision, which again is extraordinarily personal and really intense.
Last thing, hang on, Steve. One last thing. What does it say that the people who presumably know Gavin the best, people who gave lots and lots and lots of money to him when he was running for mayor of San Francisco, weren't so quick to pony up when he ran for governor. What does that say about him and the way he's perceived in his city?
You know, again, I would also say that there were, again, I guess I just don't agree with the premise that Gavin wasn't a strong fundraiser. I think that there were, I know a lot of people personally who gave, and a lot of people from his traditional base in San Francisco. In order to run for governor of California, though, it has to be much bigger than that, because the numbers are so dramatic. I mean, I'm originally from New York. I've been in California now for 10 years, but between New York and California, you really only other place that you have this kind of money is a presidential election, right? Maybe there's some other examples, but it's a tremendous amount of money. And so even if we were on pace to raise, $15 million, which is a lot of money, you need to raise more. And so I guess it's a long way of saying I think a lot of our base in San Francisco were supportive of it.
Steve, hey.
I'm sorry, just one
go
point
ahead.
on this.
Yeah.
We're getting close to the end here. First of all, I want to thank everybody for having me on what's a historic panel, because this will be the last primary panel we have, given that we have the open primary going forward. But what I think is really amazing, we've had this long discussion, especially on the Democratic side, we haven't talked about the public employee unions. And that was the key player from our perspective on the Democratic side. That goes to his argument as to why they weren't able to get any money in the governor's race, and then he turns around and runs for lieutenant governor. All of a sudden, $8 million show up. How does that possibly happen? So I think, and if you look at even the budget discussion today, right, everybody's being cut except the public employee unions. So to have a discussion about campaigns in this state in the general election or in the Democratic primary without having that front and center, I think we're missing one of the big stories.
Let me ask Steve. I want to ask Steve two questions. Number one, did you hang on? Let me. You're going to respond to that.
I'll say on the record that's silly. That's a silly argument.
Okay,
that's
but
all.
you can come back. Silly argument. But two things. Number one, did you spend a lot? Did you lose a lot of hair worrying about all that oodles of money that Gavin Newsom was raising because he was so formed? And number two, what about that? Did you guys put the screws to these folks and say, you know what? Turn off the spigot. If you want to do business and I'm going to be the next governor of California, you need to turn off the spigot and cut Gavin and cut the rest of these guys off.
Okay, good question. I mean, to Gavin's credit, he was a very energetic candidate. I think the number by the fall was 22 town hall meetings around the state. He had raised, at that point, by Labor Day, around $3 million. He had an appeal to the youth of the state. He had more than 50,000 friends on his Facebook page. I mean, it was a candidacy with some vibrancy, and obviously it was something worth paying attention from our side. I think the problem that he had was he really wasn't able to define his candidacy in a way that was going to result in any meaningful effect in the election, in the primary election. I mean, the most that was being said about us was that we weren't electable. Behind the scenes, the trash that was being thrown out was stuff that made Jerry appear to be too far to the left, based on things he had said and done in his career, and it really wasn't the kind of thing that was going to make a difference in a Democratic primary. So I think that the struggles that he had was that he was not able to define himself in a way that made him more viable than the fact that he had a youthful constituency. I mean, certainly the challenge that he had, and we tried to mention as in our conversations, was that he had raised a lot of money, but he'd also spent a lot of money, and that it was clear that he was paying his consultants way too much, and that they had drained his bank account despite the robust fundraising that had gone on. So he entered the fall.
By the way, I didn't get a dime of it.
No, Peter didn't, of course. That's true. That he's not kidding. That is true.
What about this notion of Jerry and/or his proxies putting the screws to these public employee unions and turning off the spigot and cutting off Gavin?
Well, a lot of them really didn't play in the race very early. It's the same thing that Peter said. They had a wait-and-see attitude. They want to back a winner. They want to see who has the most viable candidacy. And our poll numbers were strong, and we did stress that. And our fundraising was also strong, and how much money we had in the bank was pretty darn good too. So, we obviously stressed the assets in which he brought to a race like this, so it wasn't it wasn't like Jerry Brown was out there advertising in this primary.
No, I'll just elaborate on Steve's point, because it's actually fun to do this, because we've never actually had the opportunity to do this, but there was never anyone who came to us and said, the brown folks are putting the screws on us. It didn't happen. And I actually don't even think it's the kind of operation they would ever run. You know, so it wasn't that. What we did hear from labor, though, was that, you know, at a certain point, you got to make some decisions about this. So,
before we bring it back to the Republican side, one last thing, Steve. Jerry Brown's sitting here watching Poizner and Whitman beat each other up and just having a grand old time, doing his job, being the responsible attorney general he is. But also, the interesting position, he proposed some bipartisan debates in the spring, which is interesting because presumably he can go off and do that great job as Attorney General and watch these guys beat each other up, and yet he wants to get on a stage and start a debate. What was the thinking about that?
Well, we first, it was a constructive thing to offer up in terms of having a good dialogue.
We
about
will
the issues
stipulate to the
today.
altruism of Governor Brown and his good-heartedness, but you're in a room full of political hacks, so what was the thinking?
Well, what was wrong with that?
No, I'm.
What was right with it? Tell us.
No, I'm establishing a historic record. I'm not judging it was good or was bad. It's just interesting that, like I said, he could just let these guys throw bricks at each other, and he wanted to get up on stage and debate.
I think we were picking our spots in terms of what we wanted to, how we wanted to engage, and in the dialogue in the primary. I mean, some of the issues were forced on us, like the tax return issue that the Mercury News put out in terms of releasing taxes, and other things we had the opportunity to inject on our own, and that was one that.
And is that to say then that you never thought they'd accept the invitation, but it was a way to just keep your guys' name in the mix?
I think there was skepticism that they would accept, that there would be a three-way acceptance. I think the Poizner campaign was interested in doing it.
Sounds sort of like a yes.
So you never know. I mean.
Well, isn't it obvious? I mean, they thought that Brown would do great at debates. He's a substantive guy. He does great. We thought Steve Poizner would do great. They thought Tom Campbell. Other consultants made the calculation that their candidate would not do great at debates, which was borne out in the debates. So when you have a candidate whose consultants, you talk about the consultants, never has so much been spent on so many for so little. I mean, they told her to have a contempt for the process, that these debates don't matter, that going out in public doesn't matter. And when your consultants are telling you that, while telling you to spend $180 million, you say, why do I have to go debate? It doesn't matter. I mean, it's pretty obvious. We all thought our candidates would do great at debates.
All right, well, let's go back to those last 6 weeks of the campaign. And you said that, she had to respond to the Poizner conservative appeal. You definitely closed the gap. I guess when you were closing the gap, I mean, what was your thinking at that point? I mean, how did you feel? Did you say, this is just the way we planned it, and we going out from here? And if so,
we had them right
if so, yeah, right. And if so, what was the key in making that stop and turn the other direction?
I remember when we were down 50 points, Jim turned to me and said, "We have them right where we want them." No, I mean, there was a lot happening at the time. A lot of it was there was so much force on that side with obviously the money, radio ads and television ads. But we did have, one of the things that we were very effective at was combining what was kind of in the earned media along with our paid media, and that was able to kind of even the scales a little bit. I mean, we talked about immigration and the Arizona law a little bit, but there was also, I mean, Goldman Sachs was a huge story. It was the biggest national story at the time, and we ran a couple of ads referencing it, and that added to the to the closing of the gap. And plus, that was an issue that was, we talked a little bit about the Tea Party, but I mean, that was an issue where it kind of crossed the board of a lot of different candidates, a lot of different spectrums of the Republican Party. That was an issue where a lot of the Tea Party group was on our side because that wasn't just hitting the standard country
So
club
you think that the vulture ad was just as effective to a Republican primary audience as it might have been to a general election audience?
Oh, it was. It played out in the polling. I mean, that was very effective. I mean, so there were a few factors like that helped to the help to tipping of the scales. And and part of it was we knew that there had been so much hype about how she was very, very far ahead, 50 points ahead. And, you've seen this in other elections. When you fall that far and that fast, not many candidates have the ability to reach into their pocket and pull out another 30 million and throw it out there. She had that ability. But if you look at a lot of candidates in the past, when you do fall 50 points like that, you don't usually get up. She was able to get up, but most candidates don't.
Okay, how in your view was she able to do that? What was the key thing?
Well, her fundraising didn't dry up. Because her fundraising was her pocketbook, right? Your fundraising, when you fall 50 points in a race, in a typical conventional race, your fundraising dries up. Everybody walks away. But I think the Vultures ad was so important because, I think the general was about character.
Can you explain, just because people might be picking up this book and not know, when we're talking about the Vulture ad?
So a Vulture ad was, we did an ad, Stuart Stevens, our media consultant, where we talked about Meg Whitman being on the board of Goldman Sachs, making a ton of money off of shorting mortgages that California residents held, betting that they were going to get foreclosed on. And we had a vulture picking the carcass of a dead flush on TV, and we called it the Vultures ad. It was a metaphor. We went up with that ad, and it was a real character ad. And I think the general was decided on character. In the end, California voters decided Jerry Brown had, for a variety of reasons. You could talk about some of the stuff that happened later in the campaign. It was character, and I think that really put a dent in her, and she was able to recover because she rebooted.
In your folks' estimation, what we're talking about this 50-point gap being closed, and you spoke earlier in the discussion about Meg Whitman renting as opposed to owning, presumably, votes. What was it in your estimation? Was it the Vulture ad? Was it just people getting to know Steve Poizner? Was it things that they didn't like about Meg Whitman? What was it, before we talk about how Meg Whitman responded, which we've done, before we come back to that, in your estimation, and Duff, if you want to chime in, what closed that 50-point? What turned it from a 50-point race into something much closer?
Well, it's really easy to win a fight if the other guy isn't punching you. I mean, we were taking punches left and right on the radio from September, on TV from February. We really couldn't punch back. When we did punch back on character and immigration, where there was differentiation, she didn't take the punch very well for 6 weeks. She then, kind of rebooted her campaign with a new message and was able, she spent, I think, $15 million on mail. We spent about $400,000. Just ripping us up in mailboxes all over the state.
Okay. Duff, in your estimation, that 50-point shrinkage, what caused it? And to the extent you were privy to these conversations, what was it, to use an old George H.W. Bush line, was it Panic City inside the Whitman campaign, or what?
Well, from their perspective, from the Whitman perspective, the Vulture ad, which I thought was very powerful, they felt, from their polling, did not move the numbers Steve versus Meg. They felt it was, because they said, well, that's what Republicans do. They do deals. But they felt it was...
Why didn't they say that on the record,
No, but just the concept that I just want to be fair about this, and because it could be taken the wrong way. What they were saying is that Republicans are engaged in business, so that to be doing an ad about how somebody did business, it really wasn't going to have a major impact because people understand it's complex and you're involved in these type of transactions. But they felt that ad really had a major effect on Democrats who, up to that point, were open to Meg, and also was devastating with respect to decline to state voters. But in terms of the Steve versus Meg thing, they did not see much movement. Where they saw the real movement was when, from their perspective, and again, it's interesting how you can get different perspectives from polling, they felt the Arizona law and the passage of that Arizona law and the way Steve embraced his support of that Arizona law really hit the conservative voter at a very critical time. And so I think it's starting like April 23rd, that's when they started to see their numbers go down. And then they're right, they poured in a ton of money, especially in mail, which doesn't show up on the TV ads. And so it's not as noticeable to the press. But I think it was by May 10th, May 12th, they felt that they had stabilized.
Can I hear hindsight being 20/20, and there's an original line for you. But sticking with immigration for a second, obviously it's very clear in retrospect what happened, but was it a mistake for Meg Whitman to go so hard on immigration and then have to scurry back? And I'm sure we'll get into this in the general election panel tomorrow, but I could see where at the time there's this thinking that we've got to win this primary. Was it a mistake to go so hard right on immigration, knowing what that was going to do potentially in the general?
I can't make that judgment. It's just kind of like, asking Ben Bernanke whether he should have thrown all that money into the economy when you're in the middle of a crisis and you see your numbers deteriorating every night. I mean, that's why I don't run campaigns, so I can't make that judgment. But clearly, at the time, they knew that that was going to create problems in the fall.
Go for it.
Tactically, it was not a mistake in the sense of you have to win the primary, but strategically, it was a mistake because it wasn't true. When you go up there and switch your position and try to represent yourself as having a position you don't have, people figure it out. The voters are very smart. By the end of an intense campaign, they can figure out who's sincere and who's full of it. And that's why strategically it wasn't very smart.
Oh, here's my question. Do you think, had she not responded, specifically on illegal immigration, as strong as she has, however sincere it may or may not have been, had she not done that, might she have been able to win the primary by a narrower margin, much narrower margin, and then been better positioned going forward?
I mean, it's hard to predict that. I think it would have been much more of a very tight race at the end. And I think in the long run for her brand, it would have helped her a lot. Because I think it really muddled her brand.
Let me ask you about Steve Poizner. What you just said about being true, being who you are, being honest, voters seeing through it. Steve Poizner began his career as what I would call moderate to even liberal Republican. We, the LA Times, did a story pointing out his position on things like slave reparations, needle exchange, 100% rating from NARAL, and yet he was running as more conservative than thou. Who's the real Steve Poizner, and was that the genuine Steve Poizner that we were seeing, or did people see through that?
I've answered this question so many times. The answer is yes, that was the real Steve Poizner.
Did you get a revise and extend?
A lot of this is a lot of attacks that came on during the campaign, and Steve's responded to them. But I mean, the reality is that Steve also went through a process where he got into politics straight out of the private sector. As he grew through politics, and we're talking about a 10-year period here, his positions evolved, and he became more conservative throughout a 10-year period. And the closer he got to Sacramento, the more conservative he became. And that's the same answer he'll give you. That's the same answer we gave many times during the election.
Sacramento can do a lot to you. Jerry Brown, I would submit, is much different as a politician today than he was in his first governorship. Going up to Sacramento, seeing the tremendous waste, seeing, it's amazingly hard to get anything done, it really changes your perspective. And, the Jerry Brown that ran in the 1992 presidential race, going for a flat tax, the Jerry Brown that just cut off half the cell phones of employees in Sacramento, that is a very different Jerry Brown than the 1974 Jerry Brown who ran for governor. And I think that's good, and that's natural.
Okay, I have one question that anyone and everyone can ask. But I do, Mr. Ragone, I want to cut you off from your Twitter feed there. I want to ask you one thing before I get to a general question. Gavin Newsom, he's got the family thing going. He dropped out of the governor's race. He trashed the office of lieutenant governor. He was running. He said, quote, "I don't even know what the lieutenant governor does." Well, so how did now Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom come from that? Right, he's got the family thing. How did he go from that to deciding that, you know what, I'm going to run for lieutenant governor?
How much more time do we have?
We're going to open it up for general questions, so you got about 30 seconds.
It was actually remarkably contemplative on his part. And again, I was there for the entire thing. When it first, people had been approaching me about that for a long time. So it wasn't anything new when it first, resurfaced after the governor's race. And it was we ran an internal process for him.
But what was it? He went back and read like the memoirs of Leo McCarthy, or I mean, what was it that made him say, "By God, I was wrong about this"? That's a hell of a job. I want it.
Janice Hahn hired Gary South.
That happened beforehand.
So how did he get us from that point to that point?
It's actually, there's no like secret sauce here, folks. It's people have been approaching him, talking about it. He said to myself and to some other folks, go and, let's have a conversation about this. Because a lot of people are talking to me about it. So we went and we literally pulled everything that the lieutenant governor does. We looked at all the different functions of the office, brought it to him, and let him decide with Jen if it was something that he thought he could make a difference. I mean, you have to understand something about Gavin Newsom. I know it's hokey and everyone's going to laugh when I say it, but the guy does really dig in and live in the policy world. And in his mind, by the way, it will bear out, I'm certain of it. In his mind, he saw a lot of opportunities. UC, CSU, Commission on Economic Development, which he said the other day is going to blow up, which is part of the LG's office. He saw himself as having the ability to have an impact on policy. I'm just telling you, I know everyone's going to laugh, but that's just the kind of guy he is, and anyone who's spent time with him actually knows it's true.
Okay, quickly, an observation, and then we'll throw it open to you good and patient folks. What I've heard implicitly, explicitly over and over was that the thing that really won this for Meg Whitman was the money. It didn't dry up. Anytime she needed an infusion, she could open her checkbook. My question is, if that worked so well, if it worked for her in the primary, or let me ask the question this way. It didn't seem to work for her in the general. She outspent Jerry Brown. Why did that more money than God strategy work in the primary if it didn't carry her in the general? Anyone who wants to answer that?
I'll answer that quick since I was the one staring at it the whole time. Number one, she outspent us by $70 million. And my thought exercise is, if we had $90 million and she had $90 million, would it have even been a race? And I think the answer is very clearly no. Number two, why didn't it work in the general? The Whitman campaign consultants like to talk about brand. She built herself a $180 million brand. Unfortunately, by the time the general came around, her brand was, she's the woman with the money who won't get off my TV. Jerry Brown has a $500 million brand that's been built up since he ran for office in 1969. And that is a huge asset. That's a huge asset that he brings to the table as the governor. He has a defined brand. Poizner and Whitman had no brand at the beginning. We were both trying to build a brand, and she was able to build it a lot quicker, but it went south very quickly when people reached the breaking point of, why do I keep seeing this person on my TV?
Who else? Anyone else want to chime in? Why?
Well, of course, I kind of have a theme here, but I think that when you're looking at how the money was spent, I mean, clearly the public employee unions, I mean, Jerry Brown did spend either through his campaign or through others $70 million. So, she was being attacked in the primary by Steve and then in the general by Jerry's allies.
Okay, it's your guys and gals' turn. Sir, the gentleman with the beard, for lack of a better description.
Thank you. Thanks. My name is Michael Feinstein, former mayor in Santa Monica and Green Party National Co-Chair. With respect to Duff, I think Prop 14, top 2 jungle primary is going to be thrown out. And therefore, I want to ask a question. For the Oakland's mayor race recently, we had ranked choice voting. And the supporters of several candidates coalesced around one candidate and beat the presumptive favorite, and very much a surprise. I'm wondering, from the Newsom campaign, the Campbell campaign especially, after 14 is thrown out and people start to look to different electoral reform, and let's say we have ranked choice voting for party primaries, would that have affected who stayed in the race and what their strategy was? Thanks.
Jamie, you got a thought on that?
Well, I mean, Tom supported Prop 14 and its variations. I don't think there's any question that we would have looked at the race differently. I'm involved right now in San Francisco mayor and is ranked choice voting. So that has its own issues. I'll steer clear of those because I'm not sure about what's going to happen to 14. It does create a new calculus. I'm working in the AD4 special right now, and we have a calculus there to make about how to position ourselves, whether to put our party preference on the ballot or not. it is a new world out there. So I couldn't tell you what decision he would have made. There's no doubt the calculus would have been different.
Anyone else want to chime in? Not particularly. Mr. Traunstein, sir, there in the front.
Question for the Poizner guys. Why?
Can you speak up so everyone hears you? Wait for the mic. Hey, Ethan, there in the back, give me a signal when we're. Thank you. A little stage direction.
The question I have for the Poizner guys is, when you saw that you were getting that close, why did you pull the plug? Why didn't you go in for the kill on immigration and Goldman Sachs? We never could figure out why you didn't just go all the way home with it. Did he just pull all the money?
Well, we stayed up on the air at 1,000 points.
No. You guys backed off.
We stayed up on the air through the end of the race at 1,000 points, but it probably seemed that way because Whitman was running 3 different 1,000-point messages. We had to pick one message. We were in a situation where we had 1,000 points a week, and we had to run one message, and we stayed on immigration as much as we could. We had many meetings where we talked about, do we stay on character, vultures, or do we go to immigration? We thought immigration gave us the better differentiator. It turned out that, I don't know if that was true. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Well, I know we put on the 28 years ad, the voting ad, which is one of my favorites. But I think what people responded to was that was so unbelievable that someone wouldn't have voted for 28 years. I don't know that they really even believed it, and so that that was one area where we put that ad on, and we kind of thought that was one of our strongest ads, and because people may not have fully thought that she wouldn't have voted for 28 years. I don't know that was as effective as we wanted.
You could have done vultures on the border, sort of a twofer.
We only, this will probably be a surprise to a lot of people, we only did one set of focus groups during the whole campaign, and we showed people a 28 years ad. And people said, we don't believe that. I mean, there's no way somebody who wants to be governor didn't vote for 28 years. You guys are lying. What do you say to that?
We the people in the front. Yeah.
Thank you. You guys are wonderful. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And I've forgotten the question I wanted to ask.
Oh, well, okay. Just behind you right there, yeah.
Hello, my name's Andy Nevis. I'm a third-year political science student here at UC Berkeley. And this question is about an event that I remember in the primary that wasn't brought up. And that was back in February, the press conference that Steve Poizner had regarding an email sent by Mike Murphy, in which he asked law enforcement to investigate whether there was some criminal activity when Mike asked if Steve would consider getting out of the race. So I'm just curious if the Poizner folks actually thought there was any criminal activity there, and also if there was any subsequent change in public opinion as a result of that press conference.
Can I just enter it in the record? Poizner accuses Whitman of using, quote, Tony Soprano tactics to try to get him to drop out of the race. A Mike Murphy email, quote, we can spend $40 million tearing up Steve if we must. Bad for him, bad for us, and a crazy waste to tear up a guy with great future statewide potential, end quote.
I was going to bring a wood chipper here to represent the Whitman campaign, but I couldn't find one on eBay. I remember we had a lot of talk about this. We thought it was highly, highly immoral to say that money is the only thing that should matter, that we're going to destroy you. We thought it was likely illegal. We talked to our lawyers. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not competent to make that decision. Our lawyer said they thought it was probably illegal. So we held the press conference, and it kind of goes to a bigger point. There was tremendous pressure from former governors, from the poobahs in Sacramento on Steve to get out of this race. People flipped their endorsement, said, you got to get out of this race. We need one candidate, get behind. And if you know Steve Poizner personally, if you know me, if you know the rest of our senior campaign team, the more pressure we got, the less likely that we were going to react favorably. So when we got that email, hey, get out of the race or we're going to destroy your character, Steve was, frankly, not happy about it. I wasn't happy about it, and we felt that we had to stand up and say, we think it's illegal, but even worse than that, it's wrong. It's unethical. Is that taught anywhere in any class at Cal? The way you win a race is to go and say, we will destroy you because we have more money than you.
Why, in your estimation, why didn't this story get, there was some coverage, why didn't it get more traction in your estimation?
Well, it kind of dominated coverage for a week or so. I do think that, it was helpful to us in a way because it really kind of put us back on the offensive. I mean, we were in a bomb shelter just getting bombs thrown at us for about a month, and that put us on offensive. And naturally, I think within a week, she went up with the negative ads against us. So I don't know if that was exactly the trigger to it, but it did kind of inject a new phase of the race, and that was for the first time. She was up 50 points, and she started with the Can't Trust Steve Poizner ad.
And just strategically, if we did not have the funds to be on TV then, we knew we could get on TV talking about this immoral thing she did. We knew we would get covered for that. And also, we wanted to kind of shine a light on what kind of campaign she was running, because we did think character would count, as we found out in the general.
Way far in the back. Yeah. Hang on, the microphone's coming. That way all of us will be able to hear you.
I'd like to get an understanding. I think there's some consensus, perhaps, the Whitman campaign made a mistake by not talking to the press during the campaign, or trying to avoid. I'm wondering if, since we have all these campaign consultants up here, if you would talk a little bit about the ethics of the decisions that are driven by strategy versus the decisions that are driven by your own personal pocketbook. Because clearly running ads has a financial incentive underlying it, whereas the decision to talk to the press does not earn any campaign consultant any money. Can you talk about the ethical dilemma and also how that might have played in this race?
Dan Borenstein, I didn't recognize you, Dan. Dan Borenstein, good question. Someone chime in.
Sure, it's easy on our side. Gavin didn't run any ads, so I don't think there was any ethical challenge there for his consultants.
We had web ads.
Oh, you had web ads, all right. And, all right, that's something. But the Brown campaign, it was the contracts that we negotiated had nothing to do with ads being run or not being run, so there was no commission structure that affected any of the decision making.
On the Poizner campaign, none of the full-time staff members got paid any commission on the ads that ran. I will say, kind of for the kids that are here that are thinking about going into politics, what I've kind of saw is that when you're getting paid a lot of money, as there were many consultants in this race that got paid a lot of money, it gives you an incentive not to speak truth to power. It gives you an incentive not to tell them what they don't want to hear as candidates. You are more valuable as a campaign staffer and as a human being if you're willing to say to the person who's paying your paycheck, you are wrong. You need to talk to the press. You need to go out and answer these questions. You need to answer for why you've switched your position. When it's a conflict of interest, because the same person that is paying you, you have to give hard advice and talk about things, personal things, that are not comfortable to talk about. So I would say that you have to fight against that continuously in order to add value for your candidate.
Duff, do you want to, I mean, you've been around campaigns a long time, no? Okay. Randy.
Yeah, unfortunately, the people I would like to ask this question, they're not here to answer, so I will try with you, Duff. And
hang on, Duff. Yeah, there you go.
Again, unfortunately, the people who could properly answer this question aren't here, so I'll try with Duff. Jim mentioned that at some point Meg Whitman became known as the person who was constantly on TV annoying people. Certainly someone had to know that that was going to happen, and I'm wondering if you heard any self-doubt in the campaign about oversaturating the airwaves and that it was going to eventually come back to bite them.
I did not hear anything like that.
Well, let's not make it that short. Steve, we've heard from Jim about his view that was Whitman's brand by the time it was over. I mean, did you feel that she was hurting herself by overexposing herself?
Yes.
And did you have any data to back that up?
I guess the best would be that she was a very tall pine tree in the primary, and how easily she fell in the general. She had no root structure, and it was a shallowness that had made it a lot easier for us to contrast.
Yeah. Deborah?
Yes. I'd like to, a number of opinions here. Maybe Sterling, you'd like to talk.
Poor Sterling.
But,
Come on.
Anyway, why is it that the Republican establishment did not back Steve Poizner, and why didn't voters go for him? Sterling?
Yeah, there you go.
I have no opinion about that.
Yeah, but he just lost a bet.
I can wager some opinions. What did he say?
He just lost the bet.
One of the reasons we thought it was frankly that we thought that a lot of members and we had 8 former CRP chairmen who endorsed us. We got the CRA endorsement. We got a lot of endorsements at the grassroots level.
California Republican Assembly.
California Republican Assembly, conscience of the Republican Party is their catchphrase, and very powerful in our party. But anyway, we thought that some folks got enamored of her money. And, it was a good bet. Money in a primary can make a difference. I think there was also, we heard again and again from donors, well, she's a female, and won't that help the Republicans rebrand themselves? And, it sounds logical until you look at the election results. And in the primary, she ran better among women, and among men. And in the general, she lost women badly by even more than partisan ID to Brown.
Mr. Nail, go ahead, Deborah, you want to follow?
Let me I was going to answer the voter part. I do think that, they were very effective at their attacks against Steve. I mean, we would do these teletown halls towards the end with a lot of people, and the question we would get over and over again is, why did Steve raise his budget at the Department of Insurance? Or, why is he against Prop 13? I mean, those were things that they heard over and over and over again on television and in the radio. And again, I mean, a lot of editorial boards, a lot of the reporters here covered how he didn't raise his budget, or, the Prop 13 hit wasn't necessarily his position. But that never sunk in with voters, and they just heard this message over and over and over again, and that's what they believe.
Mr. Naylor, you had a question, sir? Over there.
I just want the record to show that Duff is not the only Stanford graduate in this among the panelists. To the Poizner campaign, it struck me when you did the hit on Whitman over immigration and made that the signature issue of the primary, that you had pretty much nailed shut any chance for you to win the general. Can you go through the kind of thinking? Was it just like, we can't win the general unless we win the primary, and we're going to do whatever we can do, no matter how bad it makes our chances, when we tick off 35% of the electorate of the state, or what? Just
yeah, I do.
How do you think that?
I said earlier, but it was that was an issue where there was a differentiating in policies between Steve and Meg. Meg took a position which was opposite of Steve's, and we knew that was one big issue that needed to be addressed, that it was an issue that was important in California that needed to be addressed, and Steve wanted to address it. So we used that as a differentiating issue between the two of us. Now, I do think had we gotten into the general, it would have been a policy debate between Steve and Governor Brown on the policy issue of immigration. Jerry Brown would have had one stance on immigration, Steve would have had the other, but it would have been a policy discussion on immigration, and people could have sided with Jerry, they could have sided with Steve. I do think what ended up happening, though, was immigration turned into a character issue, and that is what it ultimately hurts the Republican Party hugely, is if immigration is a character issue. If it stays a policy issue, people are going to disagree with it, and we felt that you get into the general election, we'll have it out. We'll have that debate with Jerry on immigration. We'll see where people stand. We didn't get there. We didn't get that far.
Fred?
Can I make a quick
comment
go ahead. on that?
Yeah.
Bob has a unique perspective. He endorsed us for a year, and then he pulled his endorsement and endorsed Meg in August of 2009. So he's seen the benefits of the candidate on both sides. And I think that when you think about it, the immigration issue served as kind of the differentiating character issue. Steve talked about what he believed in with the Arizona law, with how illegal immigration hurts the budget in California, and he stuck to the same line throughout. I think, as we saw from events, we haven't got into what happened in September and October much. We saw how events went, and when you look like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, when you have Pete Wilson on air saying she is tough as nails on immigration, and then there's pictures in your mailers of the border, and then the candidate says, I don't have pictures of the border in my mail, which she does. And then the first ad she does after the primary is in Spanish saying how great she is on immigration. All of a sudden people think, can I believe anything she says?
Anybody want to stick up for Meg Whitman on that issue? No, okay. No, just give him a chance. All right.
Fred Martin.
Yeah, Fred.
I have three things I'd like to throw out for comment. Duff, whatever happened to Parkey's Law? Secondly, did anybody look at the way in which Meg Whitman ran eBay? My neighbor happened to head a department of eBay, and he said that everything she did in the campaign, including not talking to the press, was consistent with the way she ran eBay. And I wonder if anybody considered that. And for Mr. Newsom, he went practically comatose after he dropped out of the governor's race. And a friend of mine who was very close to Newsom said the problem was that somebody said he got up in the mirror in the morning and looked in the mirror and saw his hairdo. He said he got up in the morning and looked in the mirror and saw the President of the United States. And he didn't have a fallback when the governor's race fell apart. What is your comment on that?
Peter, you go first, then I'll bring in the...
So he's the third question he asked.
Well, we'll get...
Kidding around. First, let me go back, because Phil mouthed something to me which is important, and I didn't give the whole story. When Gavin Newsom decided to run for lieutenant governor, there was a whole host of factors that we took into place, including the policy, but yes, there was some polling done that we took a look at. There were phone calls that were had with labor leaders and major donors and party leaders. So I just want to make sure, Phil, you did mouth it to me. I want to make sure that I go back and make sure that everybody knows that. In terms of the post-governor's race, the funny thing about being mayor of San Francisco, and it's probably like this for a lot of places, is that your entire life is in public. And there is no real kind of time when that stops. The mayor at the time did a series of interviews. So few of them were, obviously caught the public's attention. But he decided to take some time off from talking to the media for a couple of weeks. I don't think it's that, I actually didn't think it was that big of a deal. By the way, if you spend any time around the Bay Area, you can't actually turn on your TV any day of the past 7 years without seeing Gavin Newsom. So it's not like he was, running away from the media. In fact, the policy in the mayor's office was to try and have at least one press avail, one event or one press avail every day. Now, we didn't always make that. But for most of the past 7 years, I think the folks from the Chronicle would agree that you probably couldn't not see enough of Gavin. I mean, you probably couldn't. You'd see Gavin Newsom constantly for the past 7 years. So.
And then just ask the Campbell and the Poizner folks, was there any thought given, was there any oppo research, was there anything that suggested that Meg Whitman's record at eBay would have been an exploitive opportunity from a political standpoint?
We talked about it a lot, and I think part of it was eBay itself had created such a great brand. Going after eBay would have been pissing in the wind, essentially.
And I think that was one of the advantages she had, was that she was coming from a company like eBay, which was different than a company like Cisco or whatever, where you primarily are dealing with your board and some major vendors. At eBay, she came from a community. And the thought was every day she woke up and she had 15,000 emails in her inbox, and so that she had a degree of sensitivity to what was going on in people's everyday life. And but I don't think, obviously, she wasn't able to effectively make that transition to identifying with those individual voters as a political person.
Carla?
Oh, wait, hang on. Did you want something?
Steve always wanted to run a campaign that he could be proud of, and so I think we did run a campaign he could be proud of, and we didn't really go too much into that.
Carla?
Hi, Duffer Jamie. I want you to handle a question that certainly was raised during the campaign. I mean, and was raised by the Fiorina people, and that is, did Meg or any of her advisors, as far as you know, have anything to do with or make any kind of contact with Campbell with regard to dropping out of the governor's race, or influence his decision in any way, as offer to help him with fundraising or anything else? Certainly it benefited her when he did so.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add anything to what Tom or Bob White or our fundraiser, Kristen Huter, at the time said. As I mentioned earlier, I think contrary to conventional wisdom, with the exception of one race, Tom was a very good fundraiser in the past. He raised, over $20 million in his various campaigns. There was some overlap, so to the extent there were the same people, I guess you could say that there was some discussions. I remember we had a very close-knit group in the primary, so we were all part of the decision-making process. If there was something that happened outside of my knowledge, I couldn't talk about it. But I remember getting the phone call from Tom saying, I think it's time to look at the Senate race. This mountain looks pretty tall. We polled it. We did more than just poll it. I mean, we kind of hashed it out with our core group of 8 or 9 people. I'm sure he had conversations with people he'd raised money from before. But really, there was no, there was no conversation about, well, let's get out so we can help Meg. I mean, it's just you don't think like that at the time. It was pretty clear that Tom felt that with all the obstacles in both the races, his heart had been in the past was in the federal side, and this is a chance to go compete, possibly on a more level playing field financially. And I think he was blunt about that. He looked at that money side and said, I can compete on the Senate side, not so much on the governor's side.
So when that started happening and there were some key donors that were talking with Tom about that, what I saw was the Whitman people completely shut down because they thought it would be poison for them to even indirectly have any knowledge. So they created a Chinese wall. And I think to the credit of the donors is that once Tom made that transition, they didn't say, hey, come over here, we'll fund you, and then he left and they left him hanging. They did support him. So I think it was a sincere desire by those people that overlapped in terms of their support that they did want Tom to run.
This gentleman in the front.
So doubtless one of the benefits to the Democrats was the fact that Jerry Brown didn't really have a substantive primary. And that allowed him to stay center, whether that was who he is or whether that's what he chose to do. It was just to his benefit. The difficulty was in the Republican Party is you did have all these all these contenders. Right. Was there any attempt, and maybe Mr. Sondheim, you could say something to this, to maybe strong arm one of the more formidable candidates, which in my opinion would have been Mr. Tom Campbell or Mr. Poizner, because they were so willing to broach what I saw as some of the most difficult taboo issues like taxes or Prop 13, regardless of what those their positions on those were. Was there any attempt kind of at the macro level to strong arm one of those more viable general election candidates, because the general election is always going to be it seems to be tending toward difficult for Republicans in California?
Well, strong arm is an interesting term. So before Meg jumped to the lead, there clearly were people that said, oh my God, Jerry's going to walk through this, we're going to have a fight, that's going to make the difference, it's going to be a key element. So there were people that supported Steve that went to Meg and said you should get out, and vice versa. Then when Meg started going up by 50 points, I would say there probably were more people that were going to Steve and recommending that because of the way they perceived it. But everybody who's a significant player clearly your quarterback's getting sacked and the left tackle looks like he's just sitting there, and so you feel like you need to put somebody else in there. Clearly, everybody understood what the issue was, but how you solve it, and especially, again, our situation was we had 2 self-funding candidates. We didn't have a group or an organization or a union that's able to say, we're going to go one way or the other, not even strong arming, but just say we're going to pick one or the other. It made it very difficult.
Okay, that brings us, we're going to have to shut it off from questions. I have one more that I'm going to actually direct to virtually all the members of the panel. I do want to single out, though, Duff, you get a pass on this one. I mean, everyone basically is here because they want to be here. They're taking time out. Steve's got a budget to close. He took the time to come here. Really, there's no reason for Duff to be here other than his graciousness and his willing to fill that otherwise empty seat. So thank you. But you get a pass on this last question. Lightning round, very quick response from each of you. And we're going to start with Sterling, who didn't get to talk this whole time. One question. With the benefit of hindsight, knowing now what I do, the one thing I would do differently is?
Nothing. Nothing.
Not a thing. All right. Steve, the one thing you do differently?
And limiting it again on the period up to June the 7th.
Right. We're walking up to the primary now.
Telephone operational training.
And by that you mean? Oh, yeah, okay, never mind. We'll get to that. Took me a second. Gotcha. Peter?
That's not fair. I don't know anything like that. Come on, Steve.
One thing you do different knowing now what you do.
You could look at the way we ran the lieutenant governor's campaign. You could answer that question yourself. I mean, you know, here's the thing about politics. You live and you learn. You take your shots. You do it, and you make changes and adjustments when you do it.
But what's the one thing you do differently in the governor's race now? He ran for lieutenant governor. That's the fall he won. We're talking about the primary. What would you have done differently in the primary, knowing what you do now?
During the 15 months you were in the governor's race.
Right.
Again, I would just say everyone go look at the lieutenant governor's race. You'll see the difference. I don't want to go any further than that. I love everyone who was involved in everything. And we'll go from
Peace,
there.
love, harmony.
Okay.
One thing you do different knowing now what you do?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I would have definitely taken Cal Buzz's advice and done an ad of Steve in his karate gi with the black belt on.
How'd you go? The little victory dance over there by Robertson Trousty. Okay. Jamie, you got the last word.
I mean, we had our one decision was to stay or leave, and we have no regrets about joining the Senate race. That's for sure.
Duff, you want to chime in, please?
I had a huge surprise, and that's just how the Republican brand in this state is death, and what a major hurdle that is for us to overcome if we're going to win statewide elections.
Wow. All right, well, you guys might tease that out tomorrow in the general. I think that's it, folks. Thanks to all of you for listening. Applause for our panel.